Section 1. They say the dead can't speak. But what if I told you one boy's final breath whispered the downfall of an entire bloodline, and you were never meant to hear it? The bell rang once. A low, hollow tone that echoed across the frost-bitten hills of Salem. October 15th, 1734. Inside a dormitory lined with 18 narrow beds, Benjamin Hartwell, 14 years old, eyes wide open, lay frozen in death, arms rigid by his sides, lips slightly parted as if caught in the act of saying no. No one heard that word. No one cared to. Not when it came from children. Benjamin had been confined to the reflection chamber for 72 hours. The stone cell was beneath the main building, just past the oak pulpit, and deeper than the foundations of the chapel. No light. No warmth. Just scripture, recited through chattering teeth and prayers screamed into the void. When they pulled his body out, skin cold, knees bruised, and fingernails splintered from clawing at the stone floor, they said he passed peacefully in his sleep. But that was a lie. There are documents, buried for over 2 centuries, torn journal pages, ciphered letters, and a death ledger with spiritual failure, listed as the cause. These weren't lost to time. They were hid, learned not to flinch. They didn't escape the academy. They became it. And neither did the system that shaped them. You've seen its fingerprints, in your schools, in your job, in the way men are broken in silence and rebuilt to serve something they can't even name. Section 2. They buried Benjamin at dawn. No sermon. No hymns. Just 6 shovels scraping through frozen earth behind the chapel, while Martha Fletcher stood at the edge of the grave, her hands folded tightly, her lips unmoving. Not a tear was shed, not even a glance exchanged between the staff and the students forced to watch. But one boy saw something. 11-year-old Nathaniel Pike, whose bunk was 3 feet from Benjamin's. He saw the bruises, he saw the blood on the pillow, and he saw Samuel Fletcher's fingers twitch when the bell rang that morning, like the sound itself was part of a ritual, a signal only he understood. Nathaniel tried to speak. That same night, he whispered to an older student that something terrible had happened, that Benjamin had screamed in the darkness. By morning, Nathaniel was gone. They said he'd run away in the night. No search parties. No outrage. No one ever saw him again. But Samuel's journal, locked in a leather-bound vault for over a century, records the date of Nathaniel's disappearance with a single line: the weak link removed. This wasn't just a school. It was a prototype, a living laboratory for shaping the elite. Each student was an investment, not in their success, but in their usefulness. The goal was never salvation. It was subjugation. Break the will. Isolate the soul. Condition them to obey without question and to command without empathy. The methods were brutal, yes, but systematic. Behavioral observation, repetition of trauma, deprivation cycles calibrated to age, temperament, and familial influence. The Fletcher family called it divine alignment. Later, academics would call it psychological warfare. Think about it. Boys taken from privilege, then stripped of identity. Their every movement monitored. Their every thought scrutinized. Praise was withheld. Punishment was public. Sleep was fragmented. Food was rationed. And in the midst of this, they were taught that suffering was holy, that fear was discipline, that to question authority was to question God himself. This wasn't accidental. It was alchemical. These boys would become men who knew how to lead, not by reason, but by dominance. They would go on to become magistrates, prison architects, military strategists, men who had looked cruelty in the eye at age 12 and learned not to flinch. They didn't escape the academy, they became it. And neither did the system that shaped them. You've seen its fingerprints, in your schools, in your job, in the way men are broken in silence and rebuilt to serve something they can't even name. That didn't start in modern times. It started here, with the Fletchers. Shall we go deep? Section 3. The deeper we dig, the colder it gets. Inside a locked drawer of Martha Fletcher's writing desk, discovered in 1954 during a restoration of the estate, was a single document that historians still refuse to publish in full. 4 pages, written in her unmistakable script, entitled, The Doctrine of the Hollow Mind. It outlined a belief system darker than Puritanism had ever dared admit, that the soul of a child was not sacred, but empty, a vessel to be filled or claimed. She wrote, Disobedience is not rebellion, it is vacancy, an absence of divine order. In such absence, we must insert structure by any means necessary. That wasn't just rhetoric. That was justification for torment. Each child who entered the Covenant Academy was assigned a spiritual mentor. On the surface, it sounded noble. In truth, it was surveillance. These mentors, often older students already conditioned to suppress empathy, were trained to record every deviation in behavior, every dream, every tremor, every tear shed past midnight. This data was compiled into spiritual profiles that the Fletchers used to calibrate discipline, like engineers tuning a machine. One student, Edward Langston, endured what was called the fasting protocol, 7 days without food or light, broken only by the recitation of Ezekiel 24 each morning. He emerged blind in one eye, his hair turned partially white at the age of 15. His report read, exhibited signs of disassociation, progress, favorable. Edward went on to become a magistrate in Georgia, responsible for designing the disciplinary guidelines of 2 colonial prisons. In a letter written decades later to a fellow alumni, he described his time at the academy not as suffering, but as preparation. He wrote, What they took from me, they gave to my authority. And that's the core of it. That's the alchemy. Pain transmuted into power. The Fletchers didn't just believe in control. They believed in the refinement of cruelty into leadership. Now ask yourself this. How many institutions today reward the same thing? Compliance, cold resolve, a willingness to crush the weak for a higher cause. Where do you think that mindset came from? These aren't modern problems. They're inherited legacies. You feel it, don't you? That slow crawl in your chest. That this history isn't just a story. It's a mirror, showing you the silent codes you were taught not to question, the punishments you still carry, the authority you obey without knowing why. The Fletchers are long dead, but their doctrine is not. And this is only the beginning. Section 4. They called it divine correction. 3 words etched into the iron plaque outside the reflection chambers beneath the academy. A phrase meant to sanctify pain, to mask brutality with holiness. But the truth is simpler, colder, more surgical. It was a psychological crucifixion. Josiah Fletcher believed that pain opened the soul, not to God, but to programming. In his private letters, later uncovered in a cache behind the library's false wall, he wrote, A boy without fear cannot be led. A boy without love cannot be broken, but a boy stripped of both can be forged into anything. You need to understand, Josiah wasn't merely a theologian. He was a tactician of trauma, and his masterpiece was the routine of Day 7. Every 7th day at Covenant Academy was ritualized. Students were forbidden to speak from dawn to dusk. They were isolated, no teachers, no mentors. Meals were withheld. Bibles replaced bedding. The only sounds allowed were the ringing of the bell and the scratching of their own pens as they copied, by hand, Psalms 38 through 94. Those who failed to meet the quota were sent below. The chambers weren't dungeons in the classic sense. They were too clean, too clinical. Limestone walls, water-dripping silence, and a faint smell of burnt tallow. Each room was tailored. Some boys were confined in total darkness. Others were left beneath blinding oil lamps. Some were made to listen to whispered prayers on loop, delivered through hidden vents, recorded by Martha herself. Sleep deprivation, auditory distortion, prolonged isolation, terms we use now in intelligence manuals. But the Fletchers were doing it in 1734, to children. There are survivor testimonies. Not many, but enough. One former student, identified only as TW in court records from the 1800s, later institutionalized for what doctors called spiritual hallucinations, described seeing Josiah, his face emerge from the stone wall. He wrote, "He spoke not in words, but in thoughts. He told me I was a vessel. He said I had no name, that he had burned it from me." And the most haunting part? TW said he agreed. He said it felt like truth. That's how deep they reached, not just into behavior, but into belief, into the architecture of the self. They didn't just bend boys, they rewired them. Ask yourself, how many modern institutions mirror this? Silence, surveillance, scheduled compliance disguised as routine. How often are you told that suffering builds character, when really, it just builds compliance? This isn't a horror story, it's a schematic. And if you've watched this far, I want you to type the phrase below into the comments. Twice. Not once. Twice. That's the key. Obedience is never neutral. That's how we mark the awakened. That's how we... Section 5. The boy's name was Elijah Brandt. He arrived at Covenant Academy in the winter of 1736, barely 12 years old, the son of a colonial magistrate whose family crest still hangs in Harvard's oldest hall. Elijah was not like the others. His mind was sharp, but his eyes watched everything. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. And when he was struck, he stared into Samuel Fletcher's face with an unsettling stillness. He was, by all accounts, unbreakable. For the Fletchers, that made him dangerous. Josiah began to take a personal interest. Elijah's mentor was reassigned. His dormitory roommate was removed. He was relocated to a separate cell, isolated under the pretense of advanced theological testing. But what followed was not instruction. It was interrogation. For 43 days, Elijah was subjected to the purification cycle, a rarely used procedure outlined in one of the Fletcher family's red-bound manuals, now stored at Yale's Beinecke Library under restricted access. The process included sensory deprivation, sleep fracture, stress positions, and biblical recitations, timed to spikes in neurological stress. They were trying to crack his sense of self. But Elijah wrote. Scratched into the underside of a chapel pew were 17 lines of text. Not prayers, not cries for help, but questions. Why do they fear those who won't kneel? If God speaks through silence, why must they scream? What if obedience is the sin? They found it on March 1st. 2 days later, Elijah was gone. The official story was illness, a fever, sudden, tragic. Yet no burial was recorded, no name etched into the cemetery stones, nothing but a final entry in Samuel's journal. Subject EB did not yield, pattern non-replicable, burn notes. But they didn't burn everything. Elijah's questions survived in whispers, in drawings etched by later students, in letters smuggled. Section 6. You weren't supposed to know this name. Reverend Thaddeus Gray. He never appeared in the Fletcher family's records, never signed his name in the Academy's ledgers, but his influence, his fingerprints, are smeared across the institution's darkest rituals, like dried blood under a cracked crucifix. Gray arrived in Salem under false pretenses in the spring of 1737. Officially, he was a visiting theologian from London, there to lecture on Puritan eschatology. But the truth, buried in coded correspondence recovered from a locked compartment behind the chapel's altar, reveals a far more sinister identity. Gray was a defrocked Anglican priest, expelled for conducting unauthorized spiritual experiments on orphaned children in Whitechapel. The church erased him, but the Fletchers welcomed him. Because Gray wasn't a preacher, he was a psychological surgeon. His obsession? The removal of conscience. He believed that guilt, empathy, and moral hesitation were not virtues, but infections, weaknesses, residues of a broken human design. He theorized that through intense ritual conditioning, one could purge a child's innate resistance to cruelty and replace it with absolute loyalty to authority. He brought with him a manuscript bound in human skin, yes, confirmed by forensic historians in 2002, entitled Via Umbra, The Shadow Path. Within it, instructions for severing the psyche into compartments, training young minds to develop dual identities. One obedient and serene, the other detached, analytical, and ruthlessly logical. He called them shepherds. These techniques became the foundation for what the Academy later termed the Transfiguration Protocol, a final rite imposed on select students during their third year. The process was simple in appearance, but devastating in practice. Prolonged isolation, followed by public humiliation, and then a ritual rebirth, Gray's supervision in the reflection chambers. Some students emerged with new names, new voices. Some no longer recognized their own handwriting. One student, Thomas Wexley, was described in letters home as no longer our son, but something else wearing his skin. This isn't just abuse. This is engineering. If it sounds familiar, it should. These early experiments mirror techniques documented a century later in state-run institutions, military black sites, even covert psychological warfare programs hidden beneath national defense budgets. But before MK-Ultra, before the Cold War, there was Reverend Gray in the catacombs of Salem. The question is no longer, did it happen? The question is, how much of your world was shaped by men who passed through those chambers? Still want to keep going? Because what comes next is the part even most historians wouldn't dare say aloud.